The medieval period was a time of incredible contradictions when it came to intimate relationships and human sexuality. While we often think of the Middle Ages as a prudish era dominated by religious restrictions, the reality was far more complex and frankly shocking than most people realize. Today, we're diving deep into the bizarre, surprising, and often disturbing world of medieval sexual practices that will completely change how you view this historical period. Before we begin, I need to emphasize that we're approaching this topic from a purely historical and educational perspective. These practices reflect the beliefs, superstitions, and medical understanding of a very different time, and many would be considered harmful or illegal today. This content is intended for mature audiences interested in understanding the full complexity of medieval life. The medieval world was governed by a fascinating blend of Christian theology, ancient medical theories, folklore, and practical necessity. This combination created some truly bizarre approaches to sexuality that seem almost unbelievable from our modern perspective. What's most surprising is how these practices coexisted with the supposedly strict moral codes of the Church, revealing a society that was simultaneously repressive and permissive in the most unexpected ways. One of the most shocking aspects of medieval sexuality was the prevalence of what we would now call sexual superstitions. People genuinely believed that certain sexual acts could influence everything from the weather to military victories. There were elaborate rituals surrounding conception, with couples timing their intimate moments according to astrological charts, lunar cycles, and religious calendars. Some believed that the position of the stars during conception would determine not just the child's personality, but their eternal salvation. The medieval medical establishment, influenced heavily by ancient Greek and Roman texts, promoted theories about sexuality that seem absurd today. Physicians believed in the concept of wandering wombs, claiming that women's reproductive organs could literally move around inside their bodies, causing hysteria and various ailments. This led to treatments that involved strong-smelling substances being applied to different parts of the body to supposedly lure the womb back to its proper position. Even more bizarre was the medieval understanding of male sexuality. Medical texts claimed that men who didn't regularly release sexual tension would become ill, with the excess causing everything from madness to physical deformity. This belief led to some very unusual prescribed treatments that physicians would recommend with complete seriousness. The idea that sexual activity was necessary for health created a strange tension with religious teachings about celibacy and purity. The Catholic Church's influence on medieval sexuality created some of the most contradictory and bizarre practices in human history. While officially promoting celibacy and condemning most sexual activities, the Church also recognized the practical necessity of reproduction. This led to incredibly detailed rules about when, how, and why married couples could be intimate. There were specific days of the week, times of year, and even times of day when sexual activity was forbidden. What's truly shocking is how specific these rules became. Church authorities created calendars showing exactly which days were acceptable for marital relations, taking into account religious holidays, fasting periods, and seasonal considerations. Couples were expected to abstain during Lent, Advent, and numerous saints' days throughout the year. When you add up all the prohibited times, married couples were officially allowed to be intimate for only about 1/3 of the year. But perhaps the most bizarre aspect was the Church's attempt to regulate sexual positions and practices. Church authorities believed that certain positions were more likely to result in conception and were therefore more acceptable, while others were considered sinful regardless of marital status. These beliefs were taken so seriously that couples could be required to confess their specific practices to priests, leading to incredibly awkward and invasive religious counseling sessions. The medieval period also saw the rise of some truly strange fertility rituals and practices. Couples struggling to conceive would engage in elaborate ceremonies involving everything from special foods to ritualistic behaviors. Some regions practiced fertility rites that involved entire communities, with public ceremonies designed to encourage conception and ensure healthy births. One particularly bizarre practice involved the use of various animal parts and substances believed to enhance fertility or sexual performance. Medieval people consumed everything from ground deer antlers to exotic herbs imported from distant lands, often at great expense. The belief in these remedies was so strong that entire industries developed around providing these supposed sexual enhancers to desperate couples. The concept of courtly love, which emerged in the later medieval period, created its own set of bizarre sexual practices and social customs. This idealized form of romantic love often involved elaborate rituals of courtship that could last for years without any physical consummation. Knights would dedicate themselves to married noble women, engaging in highly stylized romantic behaviors that walked a fine line between devotion and adultery. These courtly love relationships often involved practices that seem almost incomprehensible today. Lovers would exchange highly personal items, engage in ritualistic suffering to prove their devotion, and create elaborate codes for secret communication. Some relationships involved practices like sleeping in the same bed while maintaining technical chastity through the use of physical barriers or specific positioning. The medieval understanding of female sexuality was particularly bizarre and often contradictory. Women were simultaneously viewed as sexually insatiable temptresses and as pure, almost asexual beings who barely tolerated physical intimacy for the sake of reproduction. This contradiction led to some very strange social practices and medical treatments specifically designed for women. Medieval physicians believed that women experienced a completely different type of sexual desire than men, one that was more dangerous and needed to be carefully controlled. This led to various treatments and practices designed to manage female sexuality, ranging from dietary restrictions to elaborate physical therapies. Some of these treatments involved the use of devices and techniques that seem more like torture than medicine from our modern perspective. The practice of bundling, common in many medieval European societies, represents one of the most bizarre compromises between sexual desire and social control. Young couples who were courting would be allowed to sleep in the same bed, but with elaborate barriers between them, such as a wooden board or sewn-up sheet. This practice was supposed to allow emotional intimacy while preventing physical consummation. But the obvious practical problems with this arrangement led to many unintended pregnancies. Medieval marriage customs themselves often involved bizarre sexual elements that reflected the complex social and economic functions of marriage in that era. Wedding nights were sometimes semi-public affairs, with family members and community leaders ensuring that the marriage was properly consummated. Some regions practiced customs where the bed sheets were examined and displayed as proof of the bride's virginity and the marriage's consummation. The medieval period also saw the development of some truly unusual forms of sexual entertainment and social customs. Festivals and celebrations often included elements that would shock modern sensibilities, with public displays and ritualistic behaviors that served both entertainment and social functions. These events often provided the only sanctioned outlet for sexual expression outside the strict confines of marriage. Bathhouses, which were common in medieval towns, developed their own culture of sexual practices that operated in a gray area between acceptable and forbidden. These establishments served legitimate hygiene purposes, but also became centers for various forms of sexual activity that authorities alternately tolerated and condemned. The complex social dynamics of medieval bathhouses reveal a lot about how sexual behavior was actually practiced versus how it was officially regulated. The influence of various medical and pseudoscientific beliefs on medieval sexuality cannot be overstated. People genuinely believed in theories about sexual compatibility based on physical characteristics, astrological signs, and even dietary habits. These beliefs led to elaborate systems for matching couples and predicting the success of relationships based on criteria that seem completely arbitrary today. Medieval people also believed in the existence of various supernatural influences on sexuality, including the ability of witches and demons to affect sexual performance and desire. This led to a whole category of protective rituals and practices designed to ward off these supernatural threats. People would carry specific charms, perform certain ceremonies, and follow elaborate rules to protect their sexual health and fertility from supernatural interference. The practice of medieval medicine included numerous treatments for sexual dysfunction that involved combinations of herbs, minerals, and ritualistic behaviors. Some of these treatments were relatively harmless, while others were genuinely dangerous. The fact that people were willing to undergo these often painful and and risky treatments reveals how seriously sexual health was taken in medieval society. Trade routes and cultural exchange during the medieval period brought exotic sexual practices and beliefs from distant cultures into European society. Merchants and travelers returned with stories and techniques from Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, leading to a fascinating blend of cultural practices that influenced medieval European sexuality in unexpected ways. The development of medieval literature and art also reflected the complex attitudes toward sexuality of the time. Works that we now consider classics often contained explicit sexual content and descriptions of practices that reveal a society far more sexually aware than popular misconceptions suggest. These artistic works provide valuable insights into the actual sexual practices and attitudes of medieval people. Religious mysticism during the medieval period sometimes took on distinctly sexual characteristics, with spiritual experiences described in explicitly physical terms. Some medieval mystics engaged in practices that blurred the lines between religious devotion and sexual expression, creating a unique category of spiritual sexuality that influenced both religious and secular culture. The regulation of prostitution in medieval society created some of the most complex and contradictory sexual practices of the era. While officially condemned by religious authorities, prostitution was often tolerated and even regulated by secular authorities who recognized its social and economic functions. This led to elaborate systems of licensing, taxation, and control that reveal the practical attitudes toward sexuality beneath the official moral condemnation. Medieval people also developed various forms of sexual education that seem bizarre by modern standards. Young people learned about sexuality through a combination of religious instruction, medical theory, folklore, and practical observation that created a unique understanding of sexual behavior. These educational practices often involved community participation and ritualistic elements that made sexual knowledge a shared cultural experience rather than a private matter. The influence of seasonal cycles and agricultural practices on medieval sexuality created patterns of sexual behavior that were closely tied to the rhythms of rural life. People believed that certain times of year were more favorable for conception, leading to seasonal variations in sexual activity that were reinforced by both practical and superstitious considerations. As we've explored these bizarre sexual practices of the medieval period, it becomes clear that this era was far more complex and contradictory than popular stereotypes suggest. The interplay between religious authority, medical theory, social custom, and practical necessity created a unique sexual culture that was simultaneously repressive and permissive, sophisticated and naive, sacred and profane. These historical practices remind us that human sexuality has always been shaped by the cultural, religious, and social contexts of its time. While many medieval sexual practices seem bizarre or even disturbing by modern standards, they reflect genuine attempts by people to understand and regulate one of the most fundamental aspects of human experience within the constraints and beliefs of their era. Understanding these historical practices helps us appreciate both how far we've come in our understanding of human sexuality and how many of the issues and tensions surrounding sexual behavior remain relevant today. The medieval period offers a fascinating window into the complex ways that societies attempt to balance individual desires with social control, religious beliefs with practical necessities, and cultural ideals with human realities.